Alrighty, hello folks who are on Zoom. Just getting everything up and going here.
Trevor.
Did you have a question? Someone on Zoom unmuted? Maybe on next time. Okie dokie. So hopefully other people will roll in. I should have just done it at the end of last class. But we do have a group assignment about eyewitness testimony. So if you go to our Blackboard page under assignments, you will see group assignment 5. So I'll come around and give you group numbers. I'm going to start today with our folks on Zoom. Y'all will be group 1. I'll go ahead and get you set up in a breakout room, and then I'll go around and assign everybody else. So group 1, go ahead and work through these 5 questions together. Alrighty, it should just send you to the room. If not, follow the invitation. Alrighty, so we'll have 4 of y'all be group 2. Then we go group 5 of y'all be group 3. It'll be pretty low key today. So group 1, group 2, group 3, work through all of the questions on assignment 5. And y'all can talk out loud to each other. It's okay, I promise. It's okay to talk out loud. You don't have to whisper. Just go for it. Hmm. All right, looks like maybe a couple groups are close to done. Other groups needing a couple more minutes, so I will give you about 3, 4 more minutes. And if your group is done, just kind of read over your answers, see if you fully agree with them, or feel free to add stuff to other people's answers. Alrighty, I'll go ahead and bring back our. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'll go ahead and bring back our breakout room, folks. All right, so they'll come back in about 15 seconds. And then we can talk through these. And I did the same thing I did with the last assignment. I kind of scrolled through your answers and looked who had nice detailed ones. And that's what the groups I'm going to call on are. This way in particular, if a group didn't get to a question, I'm not calling on you for that question. So welcome back, folks who are on Zoom. I was just saying, I'm going to do what I did last time and call on groups for particular questions just based on the fact that y'all seem to have good answers. So we'll start for the question about the group's reaction to the case of Jennifer with group 2.
I was talking with kind of also a lot about her, like extensively, like studying her attacker while it was happening. Like all of it, like took him away, like, and then when she had the her lineup, she picked immediately, and that wasn't who run over again, like who was there was no doubt in my mind that it was all along with them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just like a little mind boggling, right? To take someone who actually put a lot of time and energy into saying, no, I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to memorize his face while he's doing this to me. Still wasn't able to do it. And I mean, granted, there's a whole bunch of things that go into that, lighting, things along those lines, but yeah, it's kind of mind boggling. Alrighty, group 3. Let's have you talk about whether you think eyewitness testimony should be allowed in court. Yeah, I think that's such a great point that, like, yes, we have the science now, but like eyewitness can be helpful, right? Still, so we shouldn't just throw it all the way out. Yeah, totally agree with that. Okay, so group 1, we're gonna have you answer question 3. what do y'all think of Loftus's research, and did anything about it surprise you? So if you're able to unmute, go ahead, and if not, I can read it.
I think Loftus research is needed because it gives a deeper understanding of how memory works and how that memory can easily be changed by a person. And it surprised me most when she explained that false memories can be put into someone's head.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little shocking, right? The idea that we can, if we want to, intentionally implant false memories like she did in the Getting Lost in the Mall study, right? And so we have to be very cautious as investigators, as psychologists who are working with therapy clients who have been part of crimes. We want to really be careful that we don't do that. All right, group one, I'm also going to have you answer the next question. What other practical applications could there be for this research, Loftus's research, beyond the courtroom settings? It looks like this person may not be able to unmute, and that's okay. Eyewitness testimony is not really reliable on its own, especially outside a courtroom, because people do not take too kindly to telling each other's business. True. The only other time I could think of would be if a person is involved in a dangerous situation and they need to get out. Eyewitness testimony or bystander intervention might be able to help here. Yeah, bystander intervention in particular has been shown to be a really effective method against a whole host of crimes. If you just sort of like step in, start chatting to the potential perpetrator or get the potential victim out of the way, that can be really helpful. All right, and then group two, what do you think would be the best way to include eyewitness testimony in court if you were to do it?
The best way to improve it would be one, that the witness was interviewed properly, and that it's not possible that they were interviewed, manipulated, and explained in a certain way, and then it should be used to like give some details to the case and all of it, but it should still be like considered that it could be wrong while they're using it.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. That again, like Maya was saying earlier, we don't want to throw out what we know, and there can be benefits to eyewitness testimony, right? But we also have to be very cautious in how we use it. All right, excellent, y'all. I really appreciate you digging into these assignments and hearing your opinions about things. Today, we're going to start talking about profiling and detecting deception. So this will be one where we do sort of the lecture bit first, and then we will, sorry, I should have known. I've learned during the pandemic, I cannot talk and like click at the same time. So we'll go through the lecture first today and on Tuesday, and then we will watch an episode of the show Lie to Me, and look at sort of some really cool psychological science that inspired that show. So this chapter really focuses on profiling, but also detecting deception. And profiling is often something that folks who take this class or like my other psych classes tell me, oh, I want to do that when I grew up, right? I don't know if any of us feel fully grown. So we're going to start by talking about that a little bit. So behavioral scientists, so that's not only psychologists, but criminologists, sociologists, right? Political scientists, folks along those lines. And the police use criminal profiling to narrow criminal investigations to suspects who possess certain features. These could be behavioral features, personality features that are revealed by the way the crime is committed. So basically, based on the crime, what can we do? Who is the most likely to commit this type of crimes? Most profiling has been for those who commit bizarre or repeated crimes. it's really hard to do profiling off of a one-off case, right? But if you have serial murder, serial rapists, the DC sniper case is a very famous example of them using profiles, right? I don't know if y'all remember this, but this was a case several years back where there was an actual like trained sniper in DC that was killing people with a sniper rifle. It was terrifying. Also arsonists, and then mass and serial murders. They will look at this as well. Profilers have interviewed those who have committed a specific type of offense in order to learn how they select and approach their victims. So they will go into the prison system and talk to people who commit these types of crimes. So it's a little bit Jodie Foster's character in The Silence of the Lambs. It's a lot, I don't know if anyone's ever watched I think it's a Netflix series, Mind Hunters. They go and they interview prisoners about these types of things. So you're talking not to the person perpetrating this particular crime, but people who have done this type of crime to kind of find out what goes on in their mind. They'll also try to figure out how those perpetrators react to their crimes, what demographic or family characteristics they might share, and what personality features might predominate among them. So we've already talked about one grouping so far this semester, antisocial personality disorder, but there are other potential groupings. So one of the things we look at in particular with profiling is homicide offenders, in particular mass murderers and serial murderers. Historically, most homicides are committed by killers who are well acquainted with their victim. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people who kill somebody, it's a family member, it's an acquaintance, it's someone they worked with, it's a friend. And these folks tend to have a personal, but quote unquote to them, rational motive. They kill once and then they're arrested for it. However, we do look at, and certainly the media, and I'm totally guilty of this in terms of like documentaries and things like that, the media loves to look into patterns of homicide involving killers who attack multiple times, sometimes with irrational or bizarre motives, and who are much less likely to be apprehended than, you know, again, these sort of one-off folks where it's really clear who the killer is. And unfortunately, sometimes those are also murder-suicide. Right? So multiple homicides were defined by Fox and Levin in the 90s as the slaying of 4 or more victims. So you get to multiple at 4 or more. I don't know why 2 isn't multiple, because it's more than 1, but that was the cutoff they used. And it can be simultaneously, so like a mass shooting, or sequentially, like a serial killer, by either one individual or just a few individuals. So the slaying of 4 or more victims simultaneously or sequentially by one or a few individuals classifies as multiple homicides. The 2 main types of multiple homicides I already mentioned in passing: mass murder and serial murder. The mass murderer kills 4 or more victims in one location during a few minutes to several hours. So these are active shooter situations, school shooting situations. The first one of these that stands out in my mind, because I was in high school at the time, so it really resonated with me, is Columbine. You know, I was the same age as those kids who got killed. And in almost 80% of mass murders, the assailant knows the victims, at least to some degree. So again, like a fellow student, I think of the Virginia Beach City shooting. He was like a disgruntled employee or like former employee, right? So it's someone who knows the people that they're going in to kill. The typical assailant, oh, sorry, and I also should mention, usually they carefully plan out the assault, which was the case with Columbine for sure. And the typical assailant is killed at the location of the crime, dies by suicide, or surrenders to the police. So typically with mass murder, one way or another, the perpetrator is taken out of commission. Serial murderers, or we tend to think of as serial killers, kill 4 or more victims on separate occasions. And serial killers usually select a certain type of victim. They're more likely to be a stranger. And they fulfill a role in the killer's fantasies. These are usually planned even better than mass shooters or spree killings. We think about Dexter, right, and how carefully he planned out his kill rooms and how he got rid of the bodies and things like that. Serial murderers are often very difficult to apprehend. They can seem to be normal community members. People are shocked. Who was it? Was it Dahmer or Ted Bundy? One of the two. The police got suspicious, went to their house. They had pieces of dead people in their house, and the police did a cursory search and were like, "You're good," right? But they didn't look under the floorboards and things along that line. So it can be really hard. I think to this day, we're still not really sure who the Zodiac killer was. And then if we go even further back, one of the ones that's really known in the UK is Jack the Butcher. And the really interesting thing about him is that he only killed 3 or 4 people, but they were so violent that it's really cemented into the memory and the consciousness of folks over in the UK, but also here as well. In terms of motivation for either serial or mass murders, sometimes these folks are looking for power, particularly serial killers. They feel like a power over their victims. Revenge is really common. So for example, Columbine, the shooters were bullied, although it's unclear how much. Again, it's often a disgruntled former or current employee, things along those lines. Loyalty, profit, sometimes they think they're going to profit from it in some way, or just plain terror. Particularly mass shootings are acts of terrorism, right? We just don't tend to think of them that way. Or you think about something like the Oklahoma City bombing. Again, this is before I think most of you were born, but there were these militiamen all around the country. But again, things that kind of stick in my mind is because I'm from Michigan, and the Michigan militia were particularly problematic. And they bombed a federal building in Oklahoma City. If someone who was a foreign national did that, we call it terrorism, right? People tend to shy away from that word for domestic terrorism, but I think we should use it more. I think we should fully acknowledge when something is an act intended to create terror. All right, so what does the profiler do with all this information? So the first thing they're going to do is get their profiling inputs. So they're going to collect all the information available about the crime. They'll look at the evidence. If they can, they'll go to the crime scene. They'll talk to all the eyewitnesses. If the victim survived, they'll clearly talk to them. They'll look at security footage, that type of thing. Step 2 is there are decision process models that profilers over the years have created. And the profiler, this allows the profiler to organize the information. It kind of becomes like a decision tree. And on the basis of the findings in step 2, they'll do a crime assessment where they attempt to reconstruct the behavior of the offender and the victim or victims. Then they'll develop the criminal profiler. The profiler will formulate an initial description of the most likely characteristics of the suspect. Then they'll have an investigation. A written report is given to investigators who will then use the criminal profile to concentrate on suspects who match that profile that's been created. So it helps them kind of narrow down potential suspects. And then hopefully we get apprehension. Hopefully we arrest a suspect. This allows the profiler to evaluate the validity of their predictions and further refine the models for future years. Now, whenever I talk about a technique, I want to fully acknowledge when there are limitations to it. So for example, I mentioned the DC sniper case. Psychologists who work for the FBI said that based on profiling, that this person was acting alone. But in fact, it was two people, John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. They said that this was a young thrill seeker, and Muhammad was 41, and his motive was actually his political ideology. So as long as investigators, profilers are aware of the limitations, it can be helpful. But we must be cautious about the assumption profilers make, so we're not ruling out people who are the people doing it, right? Unfortunately, inaccurate profiles can be quite common. A lot of the research is done by people who are already profilers. So there's like a little bit of bias if you're researching yourself, right? And the funding and the access to the data is typically within house, so like within the FBI by their profilers. Again, there's the potential for bias, right? Concepts and approaches actually used by profilers are often not objectively and systematically defined. So that's something, anytime in science we hear that, we want to kind of like put our hackles up, right? Like, has this been tested? Is this empirically supported? So some have actually argued that profiling lacks the scientific support necessary to testify in court. So if we go back and think about, you know, what are those criteria that determines whether someone's allowed to serve as an expert witness in court, it might not reach some of those. In a 1996 study, for example, 70% of police psychologists, so people you would think would be super into this, actually question the validity of profiling. Another thing that we have to ask ourselves is, can probable characteristics in the offender profiles be based on substantive arguments which support or refute various inferred claims about the offender? Obviously, with something like profiling, we run the risk of racial profiling, ethnic profiling, right? Oh, well, this is clearly an African-American man. You know, like, and it turns out to be a white guy or someone of Asian descent, right? And so we need to be careful about that as well. Of the nearly 4,000 claims studied by criminal profilers, nearly 80% were unsubstantiated. That is, they contain no grounds, warrant, backing, or rebuttal. Moreover, less than 31% of the claims were actually falsifiable, things that you could test. Only 25% of statements and profiles were inferences about offender characteristics. So again, we want to be cautious. We want to make sure we're not unintentionally narrowing down too much, racially profiling, ethnically profiling, profiling based on age, things along those lines. So in 2007, this Snook et al., Snook is kind of a great name for someone who studies any kind of criminal justice, I love it. But they did what's called a meta-analysis, where you take a whole bunch of other studies and each of those studies becomes a data point and you combine all the data and see what the overall trends are. And so they looked at profiling and its predictive accuracy in particular. And so they found a couple different things. Possibly the most damaging conclusion in their analysis of the predictive accuracy between experienced profilers and college students like yourself showed that there's no statistical difference in predicting behavior between the two groups. So if I asked y'all to construct a profile and asked a highly trained FBI profiler to construct a profile, you would be equally accurate. So congratulations, you're all profilers. Right, that's problematic. We should be better than that at profiling. If there's no difference in predicting ability between these so-called professionals and untrained unprofessionals, then we start to see a loss of value. The meta-analysis, however, did show that professional profilers were slightly better at predicting overall offender characteristics, but this is to be expected as it is the profiler's supposed expertise. And they should, in theory, be more familiar with the literature, providing them with a wider range of options, ideas, and hypotheses. If criminal profiling is greater than chance, there should be a statistically significant difference between people who are actually trained in it and the folks like yourselves who participate in studies about it. So this is just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that no one should ever become a profiler. It just means that anyone who does should really try to increase the accuracy, right? And that should be one of their goals. Alrighty, so one of the things we've talked about, is we talk about eyewitness testimony, we talk about, you know, getting suspects in, we saw this in Detroit 187, is confessions, right? So we want to make sure that if someone is giving a confession, they are giving it freely, that they are being as accurate as possible. We are helping them to be as accurate as possible, right? And so one of the best known Supreme Court cases is Miranda v. Arizona. This is where the Miranda rights come from, that everyone sees if you've seen 21 Jump Street, right? They're like repeating them over and over to make sure they get them right. And it dealt with the problem of coerced confessions, among other things. As a result of the Miranda decision, the police must warn suspects of certain rights before starting a custodial interrogation, which includes before they arrest them. If these procedures are not followed, any damaging admissions made by suspects cannot be used by the prosecution in a trial. So that's why you got to get the Miranda rights out and correct. Those who are young or mentally disabled are especially vulnerable to the tactics of skillful interrogators. However, the Supreme Court has stated that a suspect's mental limitations or psychological problems do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that a confession was involuntary, which makes sense, right? You can have depression and still not be coerced, right? And this is from the case Colorado v. Connolly. In Jackson v. Deno, back in the 60s, the Supreme Court held that criminal defendants are entitled to a pre-trial hearing that determines whether a confession they made was actually given voluntarily. So this doesn't mean you have to have it, but if you, as the accused and your lawyer want to say, we're not sure about this, you have a right to request that separate trial, that separate proceeding. Separate hearing, sorry. Only if the judge determines that the confession was voluntary, can it then be introduced during the trial. So if the judge says, it seems like this was coerced, I don't think that we're getting, you know, an honest, unbiased, uncoerced response here, they then cannot use that in the criminal trial. So Miranda faced a major challenge in the year 2000. And this was in the case Dickerson v. United States. In that case, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the Miranda decision. And this is a good example of what's called stare decisis, which is basically that the court has a preference traditionally for maintaining stability in its decisions whenever possible. Although there's certainly times when the court has not done that because of their ideology or because of new evidence. However, there have been some other cases that weakened the Miranda ruling and the Miranda requirements. So in Harris v. New York, they said that confessions that violate Miranda may still be used at trial. And in Fair v. Michael C., confessions by defendants who don't fully understand the warnings may still be used at trial. And then Berkheimer v. McCarty, they said Miranda doesn't apply unless the suspect is in police custody. So you only have to read someone their Miranda rights if you're actually arresting them, taking them into custody. So these are things that we need to kind of always keep in mind. And then Rhode Island v. Innis said that Miranda doesn't apply unless the defendant is being interrogated, which, okay, makes sense. Okay, so let's say we've done everything right. The officers read the person their Miranda rights. They have brought them in. We are hopefully not coercing them into making confessions, right? Okay, how valid are confessions? So there are two erroneous outcomes possible. You could have false negatives, where a person says, I'm not guilty, but they are, and false positives, where the person says, I'm guilty, but they're not. And we want to be careful about both, right? Obviously. Approximately 250 false confessions have been documented since Miranda. That doesn't mean there's only been 250. There probably are more. So Kazan, a researcher, noted that 25% of people who were exonerated by DNA evidence after serving time in prison had falsely confessed. So people will falsely confess, sometimes because their public defender tells them you're going to go to jail anyway. They'll probably be more lenient if you plead guilty and you confess. You know, there are other reasons why they may be coerced, threatened, things along those lines. So then the question becomes, okay, if a confession is false, how do we prove that? The person said it. Are we supposed to take them at their word? Well, there's 4 ways in which we can be certain that a disputed confession is false. So one is a suspect could confess to a crime that never actually happened. So we could get a confession and say, yep, I murdered this person. And then that person was like across the country and is still very much alive, right? Stuff like that can happen. Number 2, it was physically impossible for the suspect to commit the crime. If this suspect is someone who is, you know, paralyzed from the waist down, and the other person was killed in a 1-story house from a blow from above, unless it's a really tall person in the wheelchair, probably not going to be feasible, right? The third is that the actual perpetrator is identified with guilt objectively established, like some sort of security footage, DNA evidence, something along those lines. And that kind of goes into 4, that there's evidence like DNA that definitively established the defendant's innocence. That being said, we obviously still do get false confessions sometimes, and part of that is due to the interrogation techniques that are used. So pre-interrogation, a technique is to quote unquote soften up the suspect. So when a suspect arrives at a police station for questioning, the police begin to subtly exert pressure on them to talk. The interrogator may try to soften up the suspect by using flattery, ingratiation, rapport building, being the good cop. And then also asking benign questions and engaging in small talk and pleasant small talk at that to kind of, again, soften them up, loosen them up. So that can all happen before the interrogation starts. They bring you food, they bring you something to drink, they say, are you okay? Yeah, right, things along those lines. Then during the interrogation itself, the police will sometimes use negative incentives. So things like accusation, evidence fabrication, and attacks on the subject's denials to break down a suspect's defenses, lower their resistance, and instill feelings of fear, despair, and powerlessness. There we go, sorry. So the idea is, if this person is guilty, they're trying to get them to confess, to say that they are. The problem would be if you're doing this to an innocent person, right? Extreme version of this I can tell you about. So they called it the advanced interrogation program, and unfortunately psychologists themselves were involved in orchestrating it, and that is what the fancy name we gave to waterboarding people. And when we used waterboarding and other torture techniques to interrogate prisoners of war, they would confess to all manner of things just because they wanted to stop feeling like they were drowning, right? And so same thing can happen in this type of scenario where the person could just confess to like get this unpleasant situation over with. The police can also use positive inducements to motivate the suspect to see that an admission is in their best interest. Well, you'll get a lighter sentence, things along those lines. And so people have started to look at interrogation tactics empirically, doing research on it. And what they found is that police are really good at getting Miranda waivers, which are waivers of your Miranda rights from suspects by just that softening up, that establishing rapport. Once your Miranda rights are waived, you don't have an attorney there to advise you, right? A lot of this stuff goes out the window. People who lack experience in the criminal justice system and those who are innocent are more likely to waive their rights and submit to questioning because they think, oh, well, I'm innocent. I don't need all that. I don't need a lawyer. That's going to make me look guilty. Oh, like recommendation. Hopefully none of you will ever be arrested, but if you are, ask for a lawyer. Don't talk till your lawyer gets there. The detective's presumption of guilt seems to lead to a process called behavioral confirmation, where basically the expectations of interrogators will affect their questioning style, which in turn will affect the suspect's behavior and ultimately judgment of the suspect's guilt. And this is something that law enforcement officials, psychologists need to be aware of and careful of in general. Right, so if we go into even like a therapy appointment with someone and we're like, this person is depressed, then everything we're gonna see symptom-wise is gonna be like, yep, that's depression, that's depression, that's depression. Whereas we might actually be seeing someone with like an anxiety disorder, right? We wanna be careful not to do that. So this is like a confirmation bias. Juveniles in particular often have difficulty understanding the rights afforded to them by the Miranda warnings. And defendants age 15 and younger are often willing to waive their rights and plead guilty, even when the evidence against them is not strong. There was this false confession study in 2004, and they found that of the 125 false confession cases they looked at, a full third, 33%, involved juveniles. So certainly a place we need to be extra cautious. So Casson and Reitzman being the original author of your textbook, I think he has since passed away and they still honor him with the Reitzman, Psychology and the Law. They devised a taxonomy to describe different kinds of false confessions because not all false confessions are for the same reason. One is voluntary false confession. For whatever reason, the person on their own decides, I'm just going to confess to this. I don't know, maybe it's easier, maybe we'll just get it over with. I've committed a crime in the past, so they're not going to believe me if I say I'm innocent. Then there's the compliant false confession, where the suspect complies with the interrogator's demands to make an incriminating statement, fully knowing they are innocent. They know they're innocent, but they'll just go along with it because basically they get worn down in the interrogation process. And then internalized false confession are where, as a result of a manipulative interrogation, suspects confess because, I mean, interrogations can be hours long, 8 hours long. And sometimes, especially if that person is in psychological distress, they'll start to believe what the investigators, the interrogators are saying. They'll be like, maybe I did this, maybe I blacked out and I don't remember it. I don't know. And so they come to believe they've actually committed the crime and therefore they confess, thinking they are confessing correctly when it's actually false. So again, that's why we want to be very careful with interrogations, because getting the wrong person behind bars doesn't do us any good, right? I mean, we saw that in the Ron Cotton case, right? Not only was this innocent man behind bars, but the other guy went and assaulted other people because he wasn't incarcerated. So how do we evaluate confessions in court? In cases of disputed confession, judges almost always decide that the confessions are voluntary and thus admissible. Part of this is probably to do with the fact that law enforcement officials know the criminal justice system better, right? And so are able to kind of say the things they know will convince the judge. And I would say, especially if it's an internalized false confession, there are probably times the law enforcement official truly believes they got a just, accurate confession out of people. Jurors are very influenced by confessions. Jurors are very highly likely to convict defendants who have confessed, even when the confession is false. So there are cases in which the false confessors pled not guilty and then proceeded to trial, show that jury conviction rates range from 73 to 81%. So these are people who made false confessions. Once they talk to their attorney, they're like, no, I'm not going to plead guilty. I'm not guilty. That confession isn't right. And jurors will still believe that initial confession and convict based on it. So it's very powerful. Jurors fail to discount a confession elicited by high pressure tactics of interrogators. This is really an example of the fundamental attribution error, which basically says if someone else confesses, it's because they did it. So they don't see the external situation as a determinant of behavior, whereas if they were in that scenario, they'd be like, oh my gosh, that person coerced me into saying it. People are generally not adept at distinguishing true from false confessions, and this probably shouldn't be surprising if the person themselves can be tricked into believing a false confession about themselves, right? So I don't know that we should expect the jurors to be better at deciphering that than the people themselves. All right, so we don't want false confessions. We know how much they're going to influence the jury. And so how can we do it? How can we reform the system to try to prevent these false confessions? A big one is recording police interrogations. And a lot of people do this now, either with audio, video, or both. And this can provide complete, objective, and reviewable records of how the suspect was questioned and what exactly they said. Recording can help halt manipulative tactics by investigators and frivolous claims of coercion by defendants, right? You get a good lawyer, even if you did it, your lawyer can say, oh, say they coerced you during the confession. Since we don't want to let people go if they're falsely claiming a false confession, right? More than half of all law enforcement agencies now record at least some of their interrogations. And there's a handful of states that mandate videotaping of interrogations. Note that when the camera is focused on the suspect, observers are more likely to judge the confession as voluntary. However, if the same confession is recorded from a camera that shows both the suspect and the interrogator, they're less likely to believe it's voluntary. So again, all the tricks that our minds can play on us, right? And the researcher Lassiter recommends an equal focus perspective, again, showing both parties, that allows observers to view both the interrogator and the suspect. This can reduce the bias inherent in just looking at the suspect. So recording, having that available to be presented in court. Okay, so if the person is lying, right? We've not elicited a false confession. They are just saying they didn't do it when they did, right? How good are we at detecting whether someone's lying, at detecting deception? Bond and DiPaolo determined that people are only correct at detecting deception about 54% of the time. This is pretty close to a flip of a coin, just chance, right? We're not really good at seeing if other people are lying or telling the truth to us. This is why poker is a thing, right? People are good at poker because they don't have a tell, right? They can, win because people don't realize they have really good cards. People generally have a truth bias. We generally take people at their word. When they say something to us, we don't assume they're lying. So we're biased towards judging statements as being truthful. People who have experience judging deceit are typically no better at it than those with no experience. Although those with experience at judging deceit are less likely to have a truth bias. And again, as we'll talk about a little bit today and a lot more on Tuesday, there are techniques you can be trained in that bring this way down. So how do we distinguish between someone telling a lie and someone telling the truth? People tend to have mistaken beliefs about the verbal and nonverbal cues to deception. So for example, one of the things we'll see when we watch the episode of Lie to Me is there's a case where they're asking a suspect a question. And while he's thinking about it, his eyes kind of drift to the side. And a lot of people are like, oh, he's not making eye contact. That means he's lying. And in fact, a lot of us, when we're asked to recall something, particularly that's like a few days or a few weeks, we kind of like look up like, right? You're like, you need to like stop the visual input so that you can really focus. It's the same reason why if you're trying to find someone's house, right, or a business address, you turn down the radio, right? Has anyone ever noticed you do that? And it's because you're trying to like decrease interference and being able to focus on one thing. There are a few reliable nonverbal cues, again, unless you're highly trained in some of the techniques we'll look at on Tuesday. And a big issue with this is that people who are asked to lie or tell the truth, or who are lying or asked to tell the truth, in general, will show signs of anxiousness, nervousness, right? I don't know if anyone's ever seen Ocean's 13. But there is like one of their sort of more nerdy members of the team, they're getting him hired in the casino and they know he's going to fail a polygraph. And so they put a tack in his shoe and have him step on it every time he answers a question. So that all his readings will be kind of like off the chart. And the guy kind of says like, whoa, everything's, the guy running the polygraph, everything's going, and he's like, I'm just really nervous, I just really want this job. Right, so you can get sort of false positives, or people can sort of trick polygraphs as well, which we'll talk about in a sec. Psychologists have had more success determining which verbal cues can reliably predict deceptive behavior. So in truthful reports, people tend to give more detail because they actually experienced it. So a large amount of reported detail tends to be indicative of truthful reports. Truth tellers are also more likely than liars to say they can't recall certain details. I have no idea, I can't recall. Liars also tend to speak in a higher pitched voice and make more speech errors than do truth tellers, so things like slips of the tongue. You can do a very specific type of interview to try to tell truth tellers from liars, and this is called the cognitive load interview. These mentally tax a person, where you like kind of hammer them for different details. You make them tell it, kind of like the stuff we do with eyewitnesses, make them tell it forward, make them tell it backwards. And it becomes really difficult to simultaneously answer a question and maintain the lie. Right? If you ask someone who's made up a story to tell it in reverse, they have a much harder time than someone who's recounting a truthful story. So then we get to polygraphs, lie detectors. So it was developed around 1917 by William Marston, who claimed he could detect lying by noticing increases in participants' blood pressure when they lied. In the 1930s, John Larson built a forerunner of the modern polygraph that, in addition to blood pressure, would also measure pulse rate and respiratory changes. Now we also measure skin conductance, which is things like basically like how clammy our skin gets, things along those lines. The problem with the polygraph is that the physiological manifestations of various negative emotions, fear, guilt, anger, nervousness, are all very similar. So basically what a polygraph tells you is this person is experiencing negative emotion, but it doesn't tell you which. Simply being suspected of committing a crime, even if you are innocent, may generate a lot of emotion that can show up looking like guilt or lying, but should not be interpreted that way. So there are different techniques for using a polygraph. One is the control question test, or CQT. And this includes relevant questions, which inquire about the crime under investigation, not surprisingly, but also comparison questions, which are calculated to induce emotional reaction because they cover common misdeeds. Prior to the age of 21, did you ever hurt someone you disliked? Well, a lot of people have gotten in like schoolyard scuffles or have done some backstabby things in middle school, right? So a lot of people will endorse that. The expectation here is that guilty subjects should be showing more of this physiological arousal by the relevant question, to which they must respond with a lie in order to maintain their innocence. While innocent subjects should show more sort of peaks on the polygraph by the comparison questions, because they'll worry that admitting to a past misdeed will make them look like they have a history of criminal behavior, and then that will make it look like, oh yeah, I did this crime. So that's one way to try to get at it. The guilty knowledge test, or GKT, the goal is to detect the presence of guilty knowledge in the suspect's mind, not necessarily to detect lying. So the polygrapher presents a series of multiple choice questions. Each alternative would appear equally plausible to an innocent person. But the true criminal will, in theory, be revealed by heightened physiological reactions that accompany recognition of facts about the crime itself, guilty knowledge. All right, is the polygraph valid? The test cannot distinguish emotions such as fear, anger, nervousness, and even excitement. The questioning methods, even on the CQT and the GKT, are not standardized. And deceptive subjects can be trained to beat the tests by taking countermeasures to avoid detection. Again, the Ocean 13 is a silly example, but if you are someone who can do mindfulness meditation or relaxation in the moment, you can actually keep everything level. I don't know if anyone ever watched the show Alias. It's kind of like a cult classic, but in there they have like this fictional brain scan lie detector, and the main character has to be trained to defeat that. And it's a lot more of like the meditation, keeping your heart level low, things along those lines. And all of these different things could lead to errors. So believing that a liar is truthful, that false negative, or that a truthful subject is lying, a false positive. The overall accuracy rate is somewhere around 65%. So not awful, but not great. Are they admissible in court? In about half the states, a defendant takes a polygraph test with the understanding that the prosecutor will drop charges if the defendant passes the test, but may use the results in court if the defendant does not pass. So, in theory. The other way which polygraph evidence is admitted is when a defendant has passed a polygraph exam and then tries to have that evidence considered in an ongoing investigation. They say, hey, I passed the polygraph. In states that permit polygraph evidence to be used in trials, judges conduct pretrial hearings, very similar to the ones about false confessions, to determine whether those polygraph results are admissible in particular cases, according to the standards of admissibility that we talked about way at the beginning of the semester in the Daubert case, the Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. The interesting thing that I have heard from law enforcement folks is that even if the polygraph itself is not that accurate, just the idea of getting a polygraph can bring stuff out in people. So my friend who's the Virginia Beach police officer told me stories about he talked to their polygraph guy and he was like, what do you do with this? Like, we know it's not that valid. And then they do it even for like pre-employment type things. He's like, people just start telling me stuff while I'm hooking them up. They're like, are you going to ask me about my past drug use? Are you going to ask me about that time in high school where I got a DUI? And so like, just being in the room with that can sometimes lead to confessions, right? And information that might be really relevant. So we'll go ahead and stop there for today. And then we'll talk about these brain-based methods for lie detection and watch the episode of Lie to Me on Tuesday. So everybody have a great weekend.